Asus just released the new ROG Ally X, which boasts many improvements over the standard Ally that should bring better battery life, performance, cooling, and ergonomics. But is it enough to dethrone my top pick of the Steam Deck OLED? Let's chat. Much of the I/O for the device has been revamped. The new Ally X features upgraded buttons, D-pad, speakers, and an extra USB-C port. The rear macro buttons have been slimmed down, so hopefully you won't be accidentally pressing them anymore. And Asus says the Ally X is 4.5mm thicker and weighs 11.5% more than the original. But they use the extra heft and girth in all of the right ways. The ergonomic improvements come in the way of larger, rounder grips and reshaped triggers, amongst other things, which supposedly makes it feel right at home in your hands. To me, it feels much better than the original, but it's not a game changer. It does have a new slip-resistant texture, which is nice. It reminds me of the Series X controller, and while I wouldn't now exclaim that it's the most comfortable handheld on the market, the changes did solve the biggest wrinkle I personally had with the original Ally. With my banana hands, the OG Ally was just too thin, with not enough space for me to comfortably rest my mitts. But with the deeper shell and more rounded edges, I could immediately tell that I'm gonna have a better time gaming on the X than the original, regardless of any other improvements. The new design also attempts to keep the micro SD card slot from cooking, so I'm hoping time will tell that that problem is in fact resolved. In case you didn't know, the micro SD card slot on the original Ally would actually cook the SD cards to the point that they've had to extend their warranties on these things because it's been such a problem. Asus also now mentions that the max charging speed is 100 watts on the Ally X, up from 65 watts on the original, which could come in handy with such a huge battery to charge, since that's the biggest upgrade of the entire new device. The handheld still comes with the same 65-watt charger, but it's nice to know in case you happen to have a larger laptop charger or want to shell out another $110 for Asus's ROG 140-watt charger, because of course they couldn't include that with the new console. But also that extra USB-C port is capable of 40 gigabit per second data transfer, which means eGPUs are now a much bigger deal on the Ally X versus the original Ally, which had Asus's proprietary XGM port, which only allowed you to buy specific models of external GPUs, whereas now you can plug in likely whatever you want and get that 40 gigabits per second on the Ally X. But speaking of power, just talking about the handheld here, Asus has replaced the 10 watt and 15 watt power modes from the original with slightly increased 13 watt and 17 watt modes. The 25 watt turbo mode is unchanged as it jumps to 30 watts when plugged in, just like on the original Ally. But now let's chat specs. This Ally X has got 24 gigabytes of LPDDR5X RAM clocked at 7,500 megatransfers per second, while the original only had 16 gigabytes of LPDDR5 at 6,400 megatransfers per second. That's 50% more RAM at 15% faster speeds. A solid upgrade. The battery and storage have both been doubled, with its whopping 80 watt-hour battery and 1 terabyte 2280 NVMe drive. That's right, it's even got a full-length M.2 slot so you can load up a desktop class drive. And we actually upgraded both the battery and the storage on our regular Ally, but the extra RAM was something we couldn't touch. You can check out this video right up here if you want to see how to beef up your old Ally if you're planning on skipping the X. But the AMD Ryzen Z1 Extreme is still the chip of choice for the Ally X, as well as its 7-inch 1080p 120Hz FreeSync premium display, so there's no changes there. But let's see if the power, memory, and cooling improvements can up our game. First up, we've got Cyberpunk 2077, which shows off some promising results for the new Ally X, as the extra VRAM has allowed it to run the game with more consistent frame times. You can see the 1% and 0.1% lows have improved quite drastically, leading to a more consistent experience. Both The Witcher 3 and Borderlands 3 saw less gains to lows, but still solid 9% uplifts and averages. And regardless, all of these numbers are better higher than the review score of the new Borderlands movie. And next we've got GTA 5, which again saw about a 9% uplift in average FPS over the original, while running significantly cooler. You may have noticed the new 17-watt mode seems to perform closer to the original Ally did at 30 watts, likely in large part due to the memory upgrades, but also thermal improvements, because higher thermal headroom means that you have higher room for your GPU and CPU to clock. It's a passive increase in performance even if the chip didn't change. And Baldur's Gate 3 gave me a really hard time on the older Ally as the 4GB memory buffer fills up before I can even load into a save. Fortunately, the unified memory architecture technology used on these AMD chips allows us to configure how much memory gets set aside for the 780M GPU. The thing is, with only 16 gigabytes of memory on the original Ally, it can be a balancing act trying to decide the best split between the system and GPU memory allocation. For Baldur's Gate 3, I recommend setting the GPU memory to 6 gigabytes on the Ally to ensure you've got the horses to get it running. Even after that, we can see the Ally X with its 8 gigabyte GPU memory buffer flexing its muscles and pulling ahead by about 10% on average FPS and over 38% on 0.1% lows when both devices are limited to 30 watts. And to illustrate what can happen if you run low on GPU memory, I left it to the default of 4 gigabytes on the original Ally in Hogwarts Legacy. And as you might suspect, it's pretty bad on the original Ally with 1% and 0.1% lows in these single digits. The new Ally sees 1% and 0.1% lows 4 times higher than the old model. It's night and day. Setting the GPU memory to 6 gigabytes improves it a bit, but still remains well behind the new model. And speaking of well behind the new model, we'll have a look at battery life. To compare the battery life between the two, we ran the 3D Mark Steellight Nomad Unlimited stress test. The test loops a graphically intensive scene to hit the system similar to how a game would. Both systems were set to 25-watt turbo mode with full brightness, and after just 20 minutes under full load, the original Ally got down to 66% remaining, and the new Ally X, on the other hand, lost only 12%, leaving it at 88% after the test had completed. This means that the old model consumed about 14 watt hours, while the Ally X only chewed through 10 watt hours in the same amount of time. The new model's max temperature was also 12 degrees cooler than the old one. This is likely because the boost characteristics are calmer on the new model, resulting in lower peak wattages and therefore cooler temps and longer battery life on top of the big boy battery that's included with it, of course. Overall, the performance is largely similar in games that aren't particularly VRAM heavy. You're not gonna see 1000 FPS more in Dave the Diver, but thanks to the new cooling system, the new Ally X is usually both cooler and quieter than its predecessor. The larger battery and redesigned ergonomics means that you can game comfortably for much longer than before, so the question then becomes, is it worth it? Because at the moment, the original Ally can be had brand new for $650 at Best Buy, whereas Asus is asking 800 bones for the new model. So listen, while Asus has certainly listened to their customers and brought solid improvements to their handheld, I don't think many people can justify upgrading to the new Ally X. I've even seen the original Ally go on sale for as little as $550 new. When that happens, it could be a really tough sell to make the $250 jump up to the X. In any case, if you're in the market for a new handheld, the Ally X is one of the best on the market if you want to stick with Windows. It's got considerable upgrades over its progenitor, but also the extra RAM allows it to gain the competitive edge against its closest Windows handheld rival of the Legion Go. The Legion Go obviously still has more tricks up its shell with how the controllers function more like a mouse and Joy-Con set, which if you know you want that, you should still head that way and pick up the Legion Go. And even though the Ally X has made a significant leap in usability, its biggest weakness, the Windows ecosystem, still makes the Steam Deck OLED just as relevant as before. The battery life on the X now gets close to rivaling the Steam Deck, but you miss out on the superb operating system that is SteamOS, and the insanely bright HDR display that is still unmatched by any other handheld on the market. 500 nits on this thing is good, but the 1000 nits on the OLED is phenomenal. And technically, the Ally X is a more powerful handheld in terms of its GPU output, but the Steam Deck offers so much more in terms of optimizations that it ends up being a moot point overall, and which handheld is faster is highly contingent on which games you end up playing. Especially when the Steam Deck OLED starts at the lowest sale price we've seen for the original Ally of $550 and the 1TB version of the OLED is $150 less than the Ally X, the choice between them becomes less simple to answer. At the end of the day, the Ally X probably doesn't do enough to dethrone the Steam Deck as the handheld console for gamers to pick up. But it does continue in the effort of well thought out mid-generation refreshes that the Steam Deck started with. But also, with the latest patch to the Steam Deck hinting at ROG Ally support, we might not have to wait long to get the extra optimization of SteamOS with the higher technical performance of the Ally. I am salivating at the day. So the Ally X solves so many problems of the original, and if it had come in at the same price point as the OG, I'd be belting its praises like I was this guy. But at $800, I'm excited to see what the Black Friday sales will be like on this thing.